When my husband Ryan and I first set eyes on the house, it wasn't the 4 bedrooms or the modern kitchen that stole our hearts. It was the lake, nestled at the edge of our property, surrounded by tall oak trees and wildflowers. It felt like a hidden treasure just waiting for us to discover. The water shimmered in the sunlight, calm and inviting, as if it had been there all along, patiently waiting for us to call it ours. We fell in love instantly. Every evening after moving in, Ryan and I would sit on the small wooden dock we built together, sipping coffee or wine, depending on the mood. The frogs would croak, the breeze would rustle through the leaves, and the world beyond seemed miles away. That lake became our sanctuary, a place where we could escape the noise of life and simply be. It didn't matter if we were celebrating a promotion or arguing about bills. The lake always made everything feel lighter. Over time, we even gave it a name. Whispering Pines Lake. It sounded poetic, fitting for something so special to us. For 5 years, we lived in blissful solitude. No one bothered us. No one questioned whether the lake belonged to anyone else. It was ours, or so we thought. One sunny afternoon, as I was watering the flower beds near the driveway, a white envelope appeared tucked under the welcome mat. At first glance, it looked harmless enough, just another piece of mail. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, written in formal language that felt more like a slap than an announcement. According to them, the lake wasn't private property. It was labeled as common area in the original subdivision plans, meaning every resident in Willow Creek Estates technically had the right to use it. At first, I laughed out loud. Surely this was some kind of mistake. How could they claim ownership over something that clearly belonged to us? But as I read further, the reality sank in. The HOA wasn't joking. They weren't asking permission either. Their tone was polite but firm, reminding me that rules were rules. Residents could fish, swim, picnic, and enjoy the lake whenever they wanted. My heart raced as I imagined strangers wandering onto our land, leaving trash behind, disturbing the peace we'd worked so hard to create. I showed the letter to Ryan later that evening. He frowned, scratching his head. "Maybe it's not such a big deal," he said cautiously. "It's not like people are lining up to use it now." But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping over me. This wasn't just about sharing space. It was about losing control. What if kids started throwing rocks into the water? What if someone accidentally damaged the dock? Worst of all, what if they brought loud music and turned our peaceful retreat into a chaotic party zone? Determined to protect what was ours, I decided to take action. The next morning, I called a contractor and arranged for a fence to be built around the entire perimeter of the lake. 8 feet high, sturdy iron bars with pointed spikes at the top. I also installed a heavy padlock on the gate and posted a sign. **private PROP no TRESPSANG***. As I watched the workers hammer the posts into place, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Let them try to come here now, I thought. Let's see how far their common area argument gets them when there's a locked gate in their way. Little did I know, this decision would ignite a war I never saw coming. The fence went up in less than a week, and by the time it was finished, it looked imposing, exactly how I wanted it to be. 8 feet of solid iron bars surrounded the lake, creating a clear boundary between our property and the rest of the world. The padlock on the gate gleamed under the sunlight, and the **private PROP no TRESPSANG** sign stood out boldly against the greenery. To me, it felt like armor, protecting something precious from harm. But not everyone saw it that way. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek Estates. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged us before suddenly seemed to have strong opinions about the fence. Some were sympathetic, nodding politely when they passed by or offering vague words of support. "It's your land," one elderly man said as he walked his dog near our driveway. "You've got every right to do what you want with it." His comment made me feel a little better, like maybe we weren't completely alone in this fight. But then there were the others, the ones who didn't bother hiding their disapproval. Mrs. Harper, for instance, showed up at our door just 2 days after the fence was completed. She arrived dressed in her usual polished attire, a pastel blouse, neatly pressed slacks, and pearls that glinted annoyingly in the afternoon light. Behind her stood 2 other members of the HOA board, both clutching clipboards like they were preparing to audit our lives. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bennett," she began, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Lovely weather today, isn't it?" I crossed my arms over my chest, already bracing myself for whatever lecture was coming. "What do you want, Mrs. Harper?" She smiled thinly, ignoring my tone. "We just wanted to discuss the recent developments regarding the lake. While we appreciate your efforts to secure the area, I'm afraid you're misunderstanding the situation. The lake is designated as common property. That means all residents have the right to enjoy it." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to snap at her. "And whose idea was that?" "Because no one ever mentioned it until now." Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "These are the original covenants established when the subdivision was built. They apply to everyone equally. You can't simply lock people out." "Well, watch me," I shot back, surprising even myself with how sharp my voice sounded. "If the lake belongs to everyone, why hasn't anyone used it for years? Why did no one say anything until now?" Mrs. Harper's expression hardened, losing its veneer of politeness. "Because you've never given anyone reason to think twice about it. Until now." Her words hit me like a challenge, and I could feel my face flushing with anger. Before I could respond, Ryan appeared behind me, his hand gently resting on my shoulder. He gave me a look, a silent plea to stay calm, and turned to address Mrs. Harper. "I understand where you're coming from," he said diplomatically, "but we'd appreciate some time to process everything. This is a lot to take in." Mrs. Harper nodded stiffly, though her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer. "Of course. Take your time. But please remember, Mrs. Bennett, cooperation is key. We don't want any unnecessary conflict here." As they walked away, I exhaled sharply, feeling the tension still buzzing in my chest. Ryan closed the door and turned to me, his expression concerned. "You need to calm down," he said softly. "This isn't going to help anything." "Calm down," I repeated incredulously. "They're trying to take away something that's ours. How am I supposed to stay calm about that?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get it. Okay. I really do. But fighting them head-on isn't going to solve anything. Maybe we should try talking to them, finding a compromise." "A compromise?" I echoed, shaking my head. "Ryan, they don't care about compromise. They care about control. If we give them an inch, they'll take a mile." He didn't argue further, but I could tell he disagreed. Frustration bubbled inside me, not just at Mrs. Harper and the HOA, but at Ryan too. Didn't he see how important this was? Didn't he understand why I couldn't let them win? That night, as we sat in silence at the kitchen table, I stared out the window at the dark outline of the fence. It loomed protectively around the lake, standing firm against the invisible threat outside. For the first time since moving to Willow Creek, I felt truly isolated, not just from the neighbors, but from Ryan as well. Still, I refused to back down. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: I wouldn't let them take our lake without a fight. The fence may have stood tall and imposing, but it didn't stop the tension from spilling over. If anything, it poured fuel on the fire. The day after Mrs. Harper's visit, flyers began appearing around the neighborhood. They were neatly printed, almost professional-looking, with bold letters that screamed accusations. Asterisk, asterisk, HOA, lake seized by one family. Asterisk, asterisk. Below that headline were bullet points listing grievances, how unfair it was to hoard community resources, how my actions went against the spirit of Willow Creek Estates, and how I was setting a dangerous precedent for selfish behavior. At first, I tried to ignore them. After all, what did their opinions matter? This was our asterisk property, not theirs. But as more flyers showed up, taped to streetlights, tucked under windshield wipers, even slipped into mailboxes, I couldn't help but feel like they were everywhere. It was as if the entire neighborhood had turned against us overnight. Then came the vandalism. One morning, I stepped outside to find the word community spray-painted in bright red across the iron bars of the fence. My stomach churned as I stared at it, anger bubbling inside me. Who would do something like this? And why go to such lengths just to make a point? Ryan suggested we call the police, but I hesitated. What good would it do? Even if they found the culprit, it wouldn't change the fact that people were determined to make our lives miserable. Instead, I called the contractor who built the fence and asked him to come clean it off. While he worked, I paced back and forth, watching neighbors glance curiously, or smugly, at the scene. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others whispered behind cupped hands. I could practically hear their judgments without them saying a word. But the real trouble started at night. At first, it was subtle, a distant splash in the lake, or the faint sound of laughter echoing through the trees. I told myself it was probably kids messing around, daring each other to sneak onto our land. But then it got louder. Music blared from somewhere deep in the woods, its bass thumping like an unwelcome heartbeat. Voices shouted insults, though I couldn't always make out the words. One morning, I discovered a pile of empty beer cans floating near the shore, along with candy wrappers and cigarette butts scattered across the grass. Each incident felt like a deliberate jab, a way to remind me that they weren't going to let me win. And yet, I refused to give in. Every time I cleaned up the mess, every time I patched a new scratch on the fence or scrubbed away another crude message, I vowed to hold my ground. This was my home, my sanctuary, and no amount of harassment was going to change that. Ryan, however, wasn't as resolute. He grew quieter with each passing day, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. One evening, as we sat in the living room staring at the TV, though neither of us was actually watching, he finally spoke. "This isn't worth it," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We're losing sleep, losing friends, maybe even losing each other. Is the lake really worth all this?" I turned to him, stunned by his words. "How can you say that? They're trying to take something from us, Ryan. Something we've worked so hard for." "I know," he replied, rubbing his temples. "But fighting them isn't working. It's only making things worse. What if someone gets hurt? Or what if they sue us? We can't keep doing this forever." His concerns gnawed at me long after he went to bed. Was I being unreasonable? Had I let my pride blind me to the bigger picture? As much as I hated to admit it, Ryan had a point. The stress was eating away at both of us, turning our once peaceful home into a battleground. Yet every time I looked out at the lake, shimmering quietly under the moonlight, I knew I couldn't walk away. Not yet. The breaking point came one chilly Saturday night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard footsteps crunching through the leaves outside. My heart raced as I crept to the window, peeking through the blinds. A group of shadowy figures stood near the fence, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were laughing, pointing, daring each other to climb over. For a moment, fear gripped me. What if they made it inside? What if they damaged the dock, or worse, confronted us directly? I grabbed my phone, trembling as I dialed 911. By the time the police arrived, the trespassers had vanished, leaving behind only footprints in the mud. As I stood there in the cold, clutching a blanket around my shoulders, I realized something. This fight wasn't just about the lake anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for us, in a place where everyone else seemed determined to push us down. But how far was I willing to go before it cost me everything? By the time Monday morning rolled around, I was exhausted, but not just from lack of sleep. The constant stress, the arguments with Ryan, the feeling that everyone in Willow Creek Estates was against me, it all weighed heavily on my shoulders. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. So, after dropping Ryan off at work, I drove to the office of a local lawyer I'd heard good things about. His name was Mr. Peterson, and his reputation for handling property disputes made him seem like my best shot at figuring out where I stood. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, and the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile as she handed me a clipboard to fill out. When I finally sat down across from Mr. Peterson, I spilled everything: the lake, the fence, the HOA's claims, the vandalism, the late-night disturbances. He listened intently, nodding occasionally but keeping his expression neutral. For once, I didn't feel judged or dismissed. Someone was actually hearing me out. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together thoughtfully. "This is a tricky situation," he began slowly. "Based on what you've told me, the lake technically falls within your property lines. However," he paused, and my stomach tightened, "the HOA's covenants likely supersede individual ownership rights when it comes to areas designated as common property. In short, they may have a legal claim to access." My heart sank. All this time, I'd been clinging to the belief that justice was on my side, that the law would see how wrong the HOA was. But now, sitting in that sterile office, I realized I might not have the upper hand after all. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Do I have to let them use the lake?" Mr. Peterson sighed, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Not necessarily. You could argue that the HOA has neglected the lake for years, failing to maintain it or enforce its status as a common area. If you can prove that, you might be able to challenge their right to access. But it won't be easy, and it could get expensive." I nodded numbly, trying to process what he was saying. Fighting the HOA meant stepping into a legal battle, one that could drag on for months, maybe even years. And if I lost, I'd have no choice but to open the gate and let them in. The thought made me sick to my stomach. On the drive home, I replayed our conversation over and over in my mind. Was it worth it? Could I afford the emotional toll, let alone the financial cost? As much as I hated to admit it, part of me wondered if I should cut my losses and walk away. But then I pictured strangers traipsing through my backyard, leaving trash behind, ruining the peace we'd worked so hard to create. I couldn't bring myself to give up. Not yet. That evening, as I walked along the edge of the lake, I noticed Mrs. Harper herself strolling toward the fence. My blood boiled instantly. She wore her usual polished outfit, looking far too pleased with herself as she approached. Her presence felt like salt being rubbed into an open wound. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bennett," she called cheerfully, stopping just short of the locked gate. "Lovely weather, isn't it?" I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, glaring at her. "What do you want, Mrs. Harper?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Just checking on the lake, making sure everything's in order." Her eyes flickered to the padlock on the gate, and her smile widened slightly. "It's a shame to see such a beautiful resource go to waste." "It's private property," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "You're trespassing." Her expression shifted, losing its sweetness. "Technically, it's not yours to keep. You're only making enemies by refusing to cooperate." "Enemies?" I echoed bitterly. "You started this, not me." Mrs. Harper shrugged, unfazed. "Be careful, Mrs. Bennett. Pride comes before a fall." Her words lingered long after she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. I stood there, staring at the fence, feeling more trapped than ever. Pride, she said. Was that really what this was about? Or was it something deeper, something I hadn't fully admitted to myself? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the water, I realized I couldn't answer that question. Not yet. But one thing was certain: giving up wasn't an option. Not while there was still a chance to fight back. The confrontation with Mrs. Harper left me seething, but it also planted a seed of determination deep inside me. If she thought her little warning would scare me into submission, she was wrong. I wasn't about to let her, or anyone else, take what was mine without a fight. But as the days passed, I realized that standing my ground wasn't going to be enough. I needed proof. I needed ammunition. That's when I decided to dig deeper. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office and requested copies of the original subdivision plans and HOA covenants. It took hours of sifting through dusty files and old maps. But eventually, I found what I was looking for. According to the documents, the lake was technically labeled as common area. However, there was a catch. The HOA had failed to maintain it for decades. No repairs, no upkeep, nothing. By all accounts, they'd abandoned their claim long before Ryan and I ever moved in. Armed with this new information, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe I could use their neglect against them. But first, I needed to confront them directly. I waited until the next HOA meeting, a stuffy gathering held in the community center, and walked in with the documents tucked under my arm. Every eye turned toward me as I stood up to speak, and I could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on me. I'd done some research. I began, my voice steady despite the nerves bubbling in my chest. And it seems the HOA hasn't maintained the lake in years, not since the subdivision was first built. If you want access now, you'll need to prove you deserve it. Mrs. Harper sat at the front table, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then she leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Are you accusing us of negligence, Mrs. Bennett?" "No," I replied firmly. "I'm stating facts. Facts that show the lake has been neglected for far too long to suddenly call it common property. If you want to use it, you'll have to start treating it like something worth sharing." The room erupted into murmurs, some supportive, others hostile. A few neighbors nodded approvingly, while others whispered behind cupped hands. One man near the back raised his hand, his tone mocking. "So what? You think you're better than the rest of us? Think your rules apply because you say so?" His words stung, but I didn't flinch. "This isn't about being better than anyone," I shot back. "It's about fairness. If the HOA wants access, they need to step up and take responsibility. Otherwise, leave it alone." Mrs. Harper's smile faltered, replaced by a cold glare. She glanced around the room, gauging reactions before finally speaking. "We'll review your concerns," she said stiffly, "but don't mistake this for permission to keep the gate locked." As I left the meeting, I noticed the way some neighbors avoided eye contact, while others stared openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Word spread quickly, and by the end of the week, tensions had reached a boiling point. Flyers criticizing me appeared again, this time accusing me of greed and selfishness. Someone even slashed one of the tires on my car, leaving a note that read, ****, SHARD, or LEAVE, ****. The harassment escalated further. Late one night, as I sat on the couch reading, I heard a loud crash outside. Rushing to the window, I saw shattered glass glinting in the moonlight. The contractor's tools we'd used to build the dock lay scattered across the yard. My hands trembled as I called the police, but by the time they arrived, whoever had done it was long gone. Ryan grew more worried with each passing day. "You're making enemies," he warned me one evening, his voice tinged with desperation. "What if someone gets hurt, or worse?" "They started this," I reminded him, though doubt gnawed at me. Was I pushing too hard, crossing a line I couldn't come back from? Then came the Saturday morning that changed everything. As I opened the blinds in the kitchen, I froze. Dozens of people milled around the lake, laughing and chatting like they owned the place. Children splashed in the shallows, dogs barked, and coolers lined the shore. Someone had cut the padlock off the gate. Rage surged through me as I stormed outside, shouting at the top of my lungs, "Get off my property, all of you." For a moment, silence fell. Then, slowly, heads turned to look at me. Some sneered, others laughed outright. One man stepped forward, his arms crossed defiantly. "This is a public lake," he said. "Deal with it." Tears blurred my vision as I swung the baseball bat I'd brought against the fence, denting the metal. "You'll regret this," I screamed. Behind me, Ryan called my name, trying to pull me back inside. But I couldn't stop, not until the police arrived, summoned by an anonymous tip. As officers escorted me away, I caught sight of Mrs. Harper standing among the crowd, her face unreadable. Had she orchestrated this? Was I losing my mind? The fallout from that chaotic Saturday morning hit me like a tidal wave. News of the incident spread faster than I could have imagined, and within hours, it felt like the entire neighborhood, and maybe even the town, knew about what had happened. The local paper ran a small article titled **** Homeowners Dispute Over Private Lake Turns Lewdly ***, complete with quotes from anonymous neighbors calling me unreasonable and selfish. Social media buzzed with comments, some defending me but many more criticizing my actions. People I barely knew suddenly had strong opinions about the lake, the fence, and me. The HOA wasted no time piling on the pressure. They sent another letter, this one colder and more formal than before. It outlined a list of grievances: vandalism, the broken padlock, trespassing, their claim to the lake, and disturbing the peace, my outburst. They demanded I pay for damages and threatened legal action if I didn't comply. Worst of all, they hinted at seeking a court order to declare the lake fully open to residents, a move that would strip away any remaining control we had. But the backlash wasn't limited to official channels. Friends we'd once trusted began distancing themselves, avoiding eye contact when they saw us at the grocery store or pretending not to hear us when we said hello. One woman who used to bring over homemade cookies stopped coming by altogether. Even Ryan seemed quieter, his frustration simmering just below the surface. He didn't argue with me anymore, but he didn't support me either, not the way I needed him to. At night, we lay in bed in silence, the weight of everything hanging between us like an invisible wall. Then came the summons to appear in front of a mediator, a neutral third party assigned to resolve disputes without involving the courts. I dreaded the meeting, knowing full well that most of the attendees would side with the HOA. Still, I went, clutching my folder of evidence: copies of the subdivision plans, photos of the neglected lake, records showing years of zero maintenance from the HOA. I was ready to fight. To my surprise, the mediation session didn't go as badly as I expected. A few brave voices spoke up in my defense, not loudly, but enough to make a difference. One neighbor admitted she understood why I'd put up the fence, saying, "It's not fair to expect someone to share something they've cared for alone for years." Another pointed out that the HOA hadn't done anything to maintain the lake until now, making their sudden interest seem suspiciously opportunistic. These small moments of support gave me hope, even as Mrs. Harper glared daggers at everyone who dared challenge her authority. By the end of the session, the mediator suggested a compromise: limited access to the lake, overseen by a reservation system. Residents could use it only during designated times and under strict rules. No parties, no loud music, no littering. Any violations would result in immediate suspension of privileges. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Reluctantly, both sides agreed. As I walked out of the room, I felt a strange mix of relief and defeat. Relief because the worst was finally over. Defeat because I knew I hadn't truly won. The lake would never be ours alone again. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The fence remained standing, though the gate was unlocked during approved hours. Families started using the lake again, but thankfully, the rules kept things peaceful. Kids paddled kayaks quietly, couples strolled along the shore, and trash bins were emptied regularly. Some days, I joined them, sitting on the dock and watching the water ripple under the sun. It wasn't the same as before, but maybe that was okay. Looking back, I realized how much I'd changed through all of this. I'd fought hard, for the lake, for my pride, for a sense of control, but in doing so, I'd lost sight of what really mattered: finding balance. Sometimes winning means letting go, even if it hurts. And sometimes sharing isn't about giving up. It's about creating space for others while still holding on to a piece of yourself. Months passed, and the lake settled into its new rhythm. The reservation system worked better than I expected. Families signed up for time slots online, and a volunteer committee, yes, including some of my former critics, oversaw the schedule to ensure fairness. Rules were enforced strictly. No parties, no loud music, no trash left behind. For the first time in what felt like forever, the atmosphere around Whispering Pines Lake became peaceful again. At first, I kept my distance. Watching strangers enjoy something that had once been ours still stung, even though I knew it was the right decision. But over time, curiosity got the better of me. One crisp autumn morning, I decided to visit during an open slot. Armed with a thermos of coffee and a blanket, I walked down to the dock, half expecting awkward stares or whispered comments. Instead, I found quiet smiles and nods of acknowledgement. A young boy fishing near the shore waved shyly, and I waved back. It was strange, but not unpleasant. As weeks turned into months, I started joining in more often. Sometimes Ryan came with me. Other times, I went alone, savoring the solitude. The laughter of children echoed across the water, and the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with this place in the first place. Slowly but surely, the bitterness inside me began to fade. Sharing the lake didn't mean losing it. It meant finding a way to coexist, to blend our lives with those of our neighbors without sacrificing everything we held dear. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I noticed Mrs. Harper standing at the edge of the lake. She wasn't alone. Her granddaughter skipped ahead of her, tossing pebbles into the water. Part of me wanted to turn away, to avoid another confrontation. But instead, I took a deep breath and approached her. "Evening, Mrs. Harper," I said cautiously, keeping my tone neutral. She glanced at me, surprise flickering across her face. "Mrs. Bennett," she replied, equally guarded. "Beautiful sunset." "It is," I agreed, glancing toward the horizon before turning back to her. "I wanted to thank you for helping make the reservation system work. It seems to be going well." Her expression softened slightly, though her voice remained measured. "It's not perfect, but it's progress, and progress takes effort from everyone." We stood there in silence for a moment, watching her granddaughter giggle as she chased a dragonfly. Finally, she spoke again. "You know, I never wanted this to become a war. All we ever wanted was access to preserve the community spirit of Willow Creek. I suppose neither of us handled things perfectly." I hesitated, then nodded. "No, we didn't. But maybe that's okay. We're all trying to figure it out as we go." For the first time, I saw a glimpse of vulnerability in Mrs. Harper's eyes. Maybe she wasn't the villain I'd made her out to be, or maybe she was, but she was also human. Either way, holding on to anger wasn't serving me anymore. When I returned home that night, Ryan was waiting on the porch, his guitar resting against his knee. He smiled as I sat beside him, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," I admitted, leaning my head on his shoulder. "Different, but good." He strummed a soft chord, humming a melody I recognized from years ago. As the stars blinked to life above us, I realized something important. While the battle over the lake had changed me, it hadn't broken me. In fact, it had taught me resilience and the value of compromise. Life, like the lake, wasn't about control. It was about flow, about learning when to stand firm and when to let go. Now, whenever I sit by the water, listening to the frogs croak and the wind whisper through the trees, I feel grateful, not just for the beauty of the lake, but for the lessons it brought with it. Some battles are worth fighting, but true peace comes from knowing when to stop fighting altogether.